The Earth spoke long before any machine did. Not with words, not with the shrill beep of a proximity sensor or the frantic flashing of an LED monitor, but with that ancient, primal language that predated every piece of technology on the planet. A low, continuous, heavy vibration that bleeds up through the packed dirt and travels straight through the boot soles of a man who knows how to listen with his entire skeleton. The massive multi-million-dollar rotary drill rig was aggressively chewing into the earth, radiating that untouchable arrogance of heavy, expensive iron. Its digital monitors were glowing, its sensors supposedly executing the flawless, millimeter-perfect precision the German manufacturer had promised in 2 different languages in the glossy technical manual. And every single monitor in the cab was flashing blood red. The lead engineer hadn't killed the throttle. "The telemetry isn't logging a damn thing." Her voice violently sliced through the deafening roar of the job site, wielding the toxic absolute authority of a woman who was pathologically allergic to being questioned. "Push the drill. Keep digging." The crew obeyed. Nobody else heard what was screaming from the dark underneath them. Nobody else felt that sickening, rhythmic, abnormal pulsing that the earth was throwing off. The heavy, consistent warning signs that nature always broadcasts right before it violently defends itself. Nobody, except the man on his knees 20 yards away, both calloused palms pressed flat against the vibrating dirt. He was 62 years old, and his face had been aggressively cured by the brutal Badlands sun for so many decades that it had achieved a highly specific texture. It wasn't just aging, it was a permanent physical record of survival. His heavy leather work boots were worn down to the absolute limit. The rubber soles ground away until the distance between his bare feet and the earth was dangerously thin. But there was something in that wear and tear that wasn't negligence. It was an intimate, necessary contact. The raw proximity you only develop when you've spent a lifetime with your ear glued to the ground. Wedged into his left ear was a battered, rusted hearing aid that hissed and popped with intermittent static. His eyes were squeezed completely shut. And then, he launched to his feet. He didn't stand up slowly. He exploded upward with the terrifying kinetic velocity of an apex operator, who had made a life-or-death tactical decision before his conscious brain even finished processing the physical data his hands had just absorbed. He broke into a dead sprint, hauling toward a heavy, rusted manual release valve jutting out of the dirt 60 feet away, an ancient, forgotten piece of iron infrastructure left over from decades ago, back when this cursed grid was something else entirely, long before it was slated to become a sleek billionaire corporate complex that currently only existed on glowing iPads. "Are you deaf?" The engineer's shriek ripped across the site, dripping with the frantic, hysterical rage of a tyrant being publicly disobeyed, infinitely more offended by the defiance than the actual physical danger. "Stop! That is a restricted perimeter!" He was already violently cranking the massive iron wheel with both scarred hands. He ripped into it with the heavy, brutal torque that only exists in hands that have wrestled with unyielding metal for longer than most of the crew had been alive, planting his boots wide in the dirt and throwing his entire back into the circular motion. The hiss that exploded out of the subterranean pipe hit the air with a massive, pressurized violence that physically rattled the oxygen. The earth surrounding the multi-million-dollar drill violently cracked. But to truly, fully comprehend the titan who was currently fighting that rusted iron wheel, you have to rewind to the gray dawn of that exact morning. To the moment the heavy transport truck rolled in, kicking up a choking cloud of red dust on a geologically radioactive grid that the arrogant corporate developers had casually decided wasn't that dangerous. The grid had been aggressively red-flagged by 2 independent geological surveys as a critical risk geotechnical zone. It was heavily sanitized corporate jargon that meant, for anyone who actually knew how to read the bloody details between the lines, that the subterranean earth under this site had a violent, unfinished history. Chaotic, unstable strata packed with lethal surprises. The exact kind of subterranean bombs that look perfectly safe on the surface, right up until the exact millisecond they blow up in your face. The developers had simply buried the reports in a filing cabinet. The billionaire corporate complex was locked onto a ruthless timeline, and corporate timelines absolutely do not budget for the earth thinking for itself. The transport truck hauling the morning shift had arrived with the depressing, mechanical normalcy of a 5 a.m. deployment. Hardened men filed off the tailgate clutching dented lunch tins and scuffed hard hats, scattering across the massive grid with the exhausted robotic muscle memory of grunts who had executed the exact same miserable deployment so many times their bodies knew the route before their brains even booted up. Old Bartholomew stepped off the tailgate absolutely last. Not because his body was slow. He deliberately held the rear because it was a deeply ingrained tactical habit. The survival instinct of a veteran who refuses to step into a war zone until he has visually audited the entire battlefield from a high vantage point, grabbing that crucial macro-level intel that the guys rushing the gate totally miss. His heavy denim jeans were violently frayed at the knees, the permanent localized scarring that only happens when a man has spent decades kneeling in the dirt, the fabric literally absorbing the memory of the labor. His flannel shirt had probably been a vibrant red and black a lifetime ago, but had surrendered to a faded, washed-out ghost of a color that was the honest, undeniable result of brutal sweat and endless boiling wash cycles. And the boots, soles worn completely bald, the heavy leather practically transparent, pushed far past the point of needing replacement. They had mutated into a second skin, the absolute thinnest possible barrier between his nervous system and the earth, functioning less like armor and more like a sensory receptor. He dropped to a knee and pressed his bare hands flat into the dirt before he did a single other thing. It was a highly specific tactical ritual that the men who bled alongside him had learned to recognize as his loading screen. The moment Bartholomew killed his momentum, planted his palms in the dirt, and closed his eyes, shutting down his compromised hearing to violently amplify his tactile radar. He had been executing that exact diagnostic sweep for 40 years. Massive commercial demolitions, deep trench excavations, heavy foundations, subterranean tunnels. 40 years of warring with chaotic hostile terrain across the country. He had learned the hard way that dirt that looks identical on the surface can be completely, violently different 3 feet down. He had learned that the earth possesses a highly volatile personality, and it always broadcasts a warning before it attacks. If you know exactly where to plant your hands and know how to shut your mouth long enough to listen. The partial hearing loss had hit him at 45. The brutal, inevitable collateral damage of surviving decades inside deafening, heavy iron demolition zones long before OSHA or the corporate suits gave a damn about handing out proper ear protection. It hadn't shattered him as a tragedy. He processed it as a tactical adaptation. The kind of biological pivot that survivors execute when they realize they have to mutate or die. With his external audio feed compromised, his nervous system aggressively rerouted the power. He developed a terrifying, god-tier tactile sensitivity that the cheap company doctors clinically dismissed as neurological compensation. His brain actively redistributed the bandwidth from his deadened ears, violently amplifying sensory channels he always possessed, but didn't need when his hearing was perfect. His calloused hands mutated into highly calibrated seismic receptors that bypassed standard human touch. He could physically feel low-frequency subterranean vibrations that the million-dollar corporate seismographs required complex algorithms to translate. He just felt it in his bones, no software required. In the trenches, the grunts referred to it with that heavy, unspoken respect reserved for things they couldn't explain. They just said he knew how to read the rock. Dr. Veronica rolled onto the grid exactly 1 hour later. Her ride was a gleaming, imported, snow-white luxury SUV. She aggressively parked it dead center in the logistics lane, right over a neon safety cone that a terrified junior foreman scrambled to rip out of her way before she even honked. She stepped into the dirt holding a pristine white hard hat, a sleek digital iPad clamped under her arm, flanked by a squad of 2 junior engineers who had learned incredibly early that shutting up and blindly agreeing with her was infinitely safer than trying to do actual engineering. She radiated that toxic, hyper-aggressive energy of performative competence. A woman who had coasted through a genuinely elite academic pipeline, and because the pipeline was elite, had violently convinced herself that her theoretical knowledge was absolute, rendering her utterly blind to anything that wasn't in a textbook. 36 years old. A post-grad specialization in advanced geotechnical engineering from Switzerland. A credential she weaponized in casual conversation with the specific, arrogant precision of someone who knows dropping the country name intimidates the peasants. The massive robotic rotary drill she had requisitioned for the site had been pitched to the billionaire developers as the ultimate, infallible silver bullet. A piece of bleeding-edge hardware that mapped the subterranean strata with such god-tier accuracy that it completely, permanently eliminated the human variable. She had deployed the word eliminated in that boardroom with a psychotic, triumphant smirk that broadcasted exactly how little she valued the men bleeding in the dirt. Bartholomew drifted toward the massive drill rig with a slow, heavy, measured stride. It wasn't the dragging walk of exhaustion. It was the hyper-calculated pace of an operator actively running sonar on the ground beneath his boots. He dropped to a knee and pressed his palm flat into the dirt exactly 3 feet from the machine's tracks. He squeezed his eyes shut. Veronica's eyes snapped to him, instantly flaring with that toxic automatic disgust of an elite executive spotting a piece of trash ruining her pristine environment, long before her brain even processed what the trash was actually doing. What exactly is this artifact doing? She barked the question at the site foreman, totally ignoring Bartholomew, deploying that specific sociopathic tactic of talking about a human being standing right in front of her, as if he didn't exist. This is a highly sensitive military-grade telemetry perimeter. This is absolutely not a staging area for manual grunt labor. Bartholomew slowly pushed himself back up to his feet. In that agonizing heavy second, his brain rapidly executed a tactical calculus he had run 1,000 times over 4 decades. The brutal cost-benefit analysis of whether or not to open his mouth, deciding whether to hand a massive, life-saving piece of tactical intel to an arrogant suit who was completely, psychologically incapable of receiving it. Decades of taking beatings had taught him that the blowback rarely justified the effort, but it had also drilled into his soul that standing in dead silence when the earth is screaming, a warning carries a psychological tax that is infinitely heavier than getting fired. He pulled the trigger. Duck. His voice was a heavy, gravelly rasp, permanently scarred by a lifetime of inhaling silica dust and screaming over diesel engines. The terrain right here is capped with a heavy clay crust that's aggressively camouflaging the strata underneath. I'm picking up a highly erratic, suppressed kinetic pulse on this specific grid coordinate. A heavy, lethal pause. You might be sitting on a massive gas pocket. Veronica let out a short, barking laugh that was completely devoid of humor. Gas? She whipped her head toward the 2 junior engineers flanking her, flashing that toxic, conspiratorial smirk of a bully, inviting her cowards to join the execution. Is the old man hearing voices in his head now? She violently turned her back to him, waving her hand at the drill rig with the dismissive, arrogant flick of a monarch ending in annoyance. My hardware is running a continuous multi-spectrum seismic diagnostic. If there was a volatile gas pocket, the algorithm would have flagged it an hour ago. Bartholomew slowly raised his calloused hand to his left ear, executing that tragic subconscious reflex that guys with hearing aids develop. The paranoid, constant physical verification that the hardware is actually seated, desperately double-checking that the horrific garbage he just heard was actually what was spoken. He took a respectful half-step forward, quietly asking for permission to close the gap, wanting to drop his voice and explain the brutal physics of the clay crust in detail, because the distance was forcing him to project, and complex engineering shouldn't be shouted. Veronica locked eyes with him, and then she executed a maneuver that is difficult to describe without using the word evil. It wasn't a hot, screaming rage. It was something infinitely darker and more calculated. It was the icy sociopathic cruelty of an elite who had absolutely never been punched in the mouth for treating the working class like subhuman garbage. She opened her mouth and began speaking with agonizing, exaggerated slowness, aggressively over-enunciating every single syllable. It was the exact sickening cadence a frustrated adult uses to mock a brain-damaged toddler, a toxic, drawn-out rhythm that was simultaneously patronizing and a horrific public execution. Listen to me, Mr. Bartholomew. Every single shattered piece of his name hit the dead air of the job site with a humiliating clarity that made sure absolutely no one missed the show. You already have catastrophic hearing loss. Are you desperately trying to prove you are completely blind too? The ambient roar of the grunts working the perimeter violently died. Nobody asked for silence. The oxygen just evaporated. Stay the hell away from my $1 million hardware. Her voice instantly snapped back to its normal, rapid-fire executive tempo. The brutal transition of a tyrant ending the theatrical torture and returning to business. Get your ass down into the deep trench and work the footings. Bury yourself at the bottom, where there is zero risk of your pathetic ignorance contaminating my data. The scattered nervous chuckles that bled out from the surrounding crew were sickening. It wasn't the laughter of men who thought the joke was funny. It was the pathetic, involuntary choking sound that cowards vomit out when they are trapped in a toxic crossfire. Terrified of the apex predator, using a fake laugh to camouflage their own panic before the silence forces them to realize they just watched a good man get slaughtered. Bartholomew stood dead still for a heavy minute. His eyes never left her face. He didn't radiate hot rage. He didn't project wounded pride. It was that terrifying, absolute zero-Kelvin stare of a master operator who has completely absorbed the intel, verified the target is a lost cause, and is rapidly calculating his next tactical maneuver before he even blinks. He calmly leveled his battered hard hat on his skull, and he marched straight for the deep trench footings, exactly where he had been banished, maintaining his signature, unhurried, heavy stride, his bald boots hitting the dirt with the absolute, unshakable familiarity of a titan who never needed thick rubber to know exactly what he was standing on. But his feet never stopped scanning the grid, and the horrific data they were uploading to his brain hadn't magically evaporated just because an arrogant suit mocked his disability in front of a platoon of cowards. The pulse was still there, low, relentless, radiating that highly specific, terrifying kinetic signature that 4 decades in the mud had taught him to instantly isolate from the chaotic background noise of the heavy iron. It wasn't the dead, flat resistance of solid bedrock. It wasn't the predictable, elastic bounce of packed clay. It was the horrifying, rhythmic throb of a volatile mass aggressively expanding under massive pressure, trapped inside a subterranean vault that had been sealed for centuries and was rapidly approaching the absolute mathematical limit of what the rock could contain. He hit the bottom of the trench, and he waited, because he had learned through 40 brutal years of warring with dirt that always knew infinitely more than the shiny machines, that the earth absolutely always honors its threats. The variable is never if it's going to blow. The only variable is when, and the timer was rapidly ticking down to 0. The grueling days trapped at the bottom of the deep trench carried a suffocating psychological weight. It wasn't just the toxic humiliation of being banished, although that was the explicit intent of the order. It was the highly specific claustrophobic reality of a deep excavation pit, a brutal environment where the sprawling, chaotic world above is violently reduced to a tiny, blinding rectangle of sky, and the roaring acoustics of the heavy iron are heavily muffled and distorted by the sheer towering walls of packed clay surrounding you on all sides. It's a psychological pressure cooker that rapidly triggers severe anxiety in most grunts, forcing them to frantically scramble up the ladders every few hours just to see the horizon and verify the universe still exists outside the hole. Bartholomew didn't feel an ounce of that panic. He had spent enough of his life buried at the bottom of massive excavations that the deep trench had morphed into something deeply familiar. It wasn't exactly a comfort zone, but it was a recognized operational environment. The kind of raw, physical connection a man develops when he has spent enough thousands of hours locked in a space to finally learn its native language. And the bottom of that specific trench was screaming. The tactical orders bled down through his cheap, crackling radio with the horrific, garbled distortion typical of garbage job site comms. Voices that were already difficult to track in a quiet room were violently shredded into fragmented static by the time they hit the bottom of the pit, forcing a listener to constantly play a high-stakes guessing game to stitch the commands together. For an operator battling severe hearing loss like Bartholomew, the radio chatter wasn't instructions. It was a chaotic puzzle. He was forced to aggressively reverse-engineer the incoming orders based on environmental context and his massive, 4-decade database of knowing exactly what a foreman should be demanding during this specific phase of a deep-footing pour. Absolutely no one in the corporate trailer gave a damn that this was a lethal safety hazard. He executed the mission. The brutal labor was completed flawlessly. The heavy concrete footings advanced exactly on schedule. The young foreman aggressively checked the boxes on his iPad and sprinted to the next fire. But Bartholomew's hands never stopped tracking the threat. There was a highly specific coordinate, roughly 40 yards away, directly on the vector he had mentally tagged as the southern quadrant. Whenever the massive rotary drill spun up, the seismic vibration bleeding through the clay carried that exact, terrifying, mutated frequency he had flagged on day 1, and the subsequent days had only violently confirmed it, with the Earth deploying that relentless consistency it uses when it's desperately trying to broadcast a catastrophe until someone finally listens. It was a vibration that dampened with a sickening, specific acoustic deadness. Not the sharp, aggressive recoil of solid bedrock, which absorbs and violently kicks back kinetic energy with a harsh mathematical regularity. Not the dull, predictable flex of heavily compacted clay. It was a terrifying, hollow dampening that screamed void. It was the exact, undeniable physical phenomenon that 40 years in the mud teaches you to recognize long before any million-dollar ground-penetrating radar confirms it. The horrifying sensation that there is a massive, hollow chamber buried beneath you that has absolutely no business being empty, and whatever is currently occupying that void is absolutely not solid rock. In the hardcore old-school demolition game, that kind of subterranean trap had a name, a blowout pocket, and massive blowout pockets buried in the specific geological history of this regional strata possessed a terrifying, fatal tendency to harbor highly volatile, hyper-pressurized methane. Pockets that had been compounding pressure for millennia, building a violent, explosive impatience that the shiny corporate seismographs frequently failed to detect because the ultra-dense clay crust acted like a heavy acoustic silencer, shielding the bomb from the sensors. On a blistering afternoon, when the harsh sunlight finally slashed through the narrow opening at the top of the trench at that specific, severe angle that signals the shift is almost dead, Bartholomew climbed the ladder. He took it slow, agonizing rung by agonizing rung, deploying the calculated heavy pace of a veteran, giving his battered nervous system the mandatory seconds it needs to recalibrate before demanding another spike of adrenaline. He crested the lip of the trench, absorbing the violent wave of open-air heat that always contrasts the cool dampness of the pit, and marched straight toward the site foreman. The kid was frantically punching data into his digital clipboard, radiating the frantic, sweaty panic of a junior manager who has twice as many fires to put out as he has water. "Boss?" Bartholomew stopped at the exact respectful distance, the precise, unwritten perimeter the trenches teach you to maintain when you need to drop heavy intel without turning it into a public spectacle. That exact coordinate over there, the southern quadrant where the rotary drill is scheduled to punch through tomorrow morning. He pointed a calloused, scarred finger at the zone with the dead reckoning accuracy of an operator who doesn't need a map because the grid is burned into his brain. The Earth is catastrophically soft in that pocket. There is a massive subterranean void. It is a highly pressurized gas pocket. The foreman ripped his eyes off the iPad. His face contorted into that agonizing, trapped expression of a middle manager catching a live grenade he has absolutely no idea what to do with. He understood enough of the raw physics to know the old man wasn't crazy, but he was completely paralyzed by the rigid, toxic corporate hierarchy that had already dictated the reality of the site. Bartholomew. His tone dropped into that pathetic, pacifying register of a guy trying to be polite while following a suicide order. Just go clock out, get some rest. Bartholomew held his ground, dead silent. The chief explicitly stated the multi-spectrum sensors came back completely negative. The foreman immediately dropped his eyes back to the iPad, executing the cowardly, evasive maneuver of a guy desperately trying to kill a conversation before it forces him to make a hard choice. "I know you've got this whole dirt whisperer routine going, but she holds the Ivy League degree. The math is the math." The final sentence didn't carry any malicious cruelty. It just carried the suffocating, pathetic fatalism of a kid who blindly worships the corporate algorithm because he has never survived a disaster that proved the algorithm wrong. Bartholomew stood paralyzed in the dirt for one heavy, agonizing second. Then he turned his back and walked away. That night, locked inside the suffocating, sweltering plywood box of the temporary labor camp, surviving on a razor-thin foam mattress, staring out a shattered window that refused to close, the deafening roar of heavy transport trucks violently shaking the walls from the highway 100 yards away. He didn't sleep a single minute. He laid flat on his back, staring into the pitch-black void, aggressively analyzing the specific, terrifying frequency of that subterranean vibration. He knew from brutal experience that there were different breeds of blowout pockets. Some were dormant. They would hold massive pressure for weeks, patiently waiting for the structural integrity of the surrounding rock to slowly degrade before violently seeking the path of least resistance and exploding. Others were already riding the absolute ragged edge of terminal failure, pockets where the very next heavy industrial vibration would act as the final, catastrophic trigger, the single microscopic straw that violently breaks the camel's back. He had no way of confirming exactly which category this specific bomb fell into, but he knew for a mathematical fact that the massive multi-ton rotary drill was scheduled to violently rip through the southern quadrant at dawn, and it was the very next morning, right before the shift whistle blew to send him back into the deep trench, that he made a tactical decision he knew carried a massive, permanent cost. The chief's mobile command trailer was dumped on the extreme edge of the grid, boasting a large plexiglass window overlooking the primary excavation zone and a heavy steel security door that had been slapped on with the cheap, utilitarian efficiency of corporate temporary housing built strictly to function, not to last. Veronica was locked inside with her two junior yes-men, aggressively projecting the daily drilling vector onto a massive 4K monitor. The sterile, glowing digital lines sliced across the subterranean map with a flawless mathematical clarity, that was utterly alien to the raw, analog reality Bartholomew read with his calloused hands. He pulled his crushed straw hat off his head before he even knocked. He breached the door the second he heard the command. There was a massive, profound weight behind the simple gesture of removing that hat. It wasn't subservience. It was the deeply ingrained, honorable posture of a master who has walked into a room fully acknowledging that he is about to require every single ounce of diplomacy available. An intentional, physical lowering of his own ego, deliberately creating space so the incoming life-saving intel might actually bypass the arrogant armor of the suits and be heard. "Chief." His voice was a low, dead calm rumble, projecting the ironclad stability of a man delivering critical intel that absolutely must be heard, regardless of the incoming crossfire. "I have run heavy demolition operations for 40 straight years. I have personally witnessed this exact catastrophic setup detonate on 3 different grids." Veronica didn't rip her eyes off the glowing 4K monitor. She kept staring at the fake reality. Whenever the subterranean clay violently shifts color like that, it is heavily camouflaging a massive gas pocket. He pushed forward because he had breached the wire and the mission had to be completed. Your $1 million drill isn't flagging it because the hyperdense clay cap is acting as an acoustic silencer, completely blocking the seismic signature of the void. Your sensors are only reading the armor. They are completely blind to the bomb hiding behind it. A heavy, tactical pause. You absolutely must order a manual core sample strike in the southern quadrant before you advance that drill. A manual, heavy steel probe will physically confirm the blowout pocket in under 15 minutes. Veronica violently shoved her ergonomic chair back, and then she executed a maneuver that she probably hadn't even consciously planned. Or perhaps her toxic arrogance had become so deeply hardwired that the cruelty was pure, automatic reflex. She marched straight to the heavy steel door of the trailer and violently kicked it wide open. She stood dead center in the doorway, pitching her voice to the exact aggressive decibel level required to ensure every single grunt within a 50-yard radius caught the execution. "I want everyone to pay very close attention to this." The junior techs scrambling outside froze. The heavy laborers hauling rebar slowed their pace to a crawl, executing the involuntary, rubbernecking reflex that a job site instantly produces when the atmospheric pressure signals a massive public bloodbath is imminent. An illiterate, half-deaf grunt is currently attempting to deliver a masterclass in advanced geotechnical engineering to a fully licensed executive who holds a postgraduate degree from Switzerland. Every single syllable was aggressively selected and weaponized with the terrifying precision of a sniper, hunting for the absolute most vulnerable psychological targets, dragging them out into the blinding sunlight, as if publicly listing a man's disabilities was a legitimate corporate defense. Illiterate, half-deaf. Bartholomew stood paralyzed dead center in the air-conditioned trailer, gripping his crushed straw hat, the rusted hearing aid still whistling in his left ear, carrying the heavy ghost of 40 years of brutal labor in his spine. He absorbed the radioactive venom with that terrifying absolute immobility that isn't shock. It's the hyper-compressed millisecond right before a master operator decides exactly how to retaliate. The microscopic window where the brain logs the catastrophic damage before deciding whether to return fire or walk away. Veronica whipped her head back to him. Her manicured fingers shot out, executing that highly specific, aggressive pointing gesture that had become the trademark physical signature of her tyranny. The violent extension of the arm that is a guilty verdict long before it's an order. Your designated operational zone is at the bottom of a mud pit, not breathing the oxygen in my command center. Her voice plummeted in volume, but violently spiked in its radioactive intensity. If I hear one more pathetic, superstitious warning out of your mouth, I will personally terminate you for gross insubordination and have you thrown off my grid. A suffocating, lethal pause. Since you are so damn obsessed with feeling the earth, you can feel what it's like to starve without a paycheck. The silence that choked out the command trailer was the horrifying, absolute silence of a war zone when it collectively decides it has absolutely no idea how to process the atrocity it just witnessed. The deafening, cowardly quiet that is, in itself, a massive collective failure, revealing infinitely more about the spineless witnesses than any scream of protest ever could. Bartholomew calmly placed his crushed hat back onto his head. He turned his back on her, and he marched straight for the ladder leading down into the deep trench, maintaining his signature, unhurried, heavy stride. The exact same stride that had conquered hellish job sites for 4 decades, completely unfazed. because absolutely nothing that arrogant suit had vomited out of her mouth possessed the power to alter the fundamental physics of how his boots struck the earth. But there was a catastrophic, undeniable difference this time. When he hit the lip of the trench and locked his boot onto the first steel rung, a heavy streak of moisture broke loose and tracked down his weathered face. It absolutely wasn't sweat. It was the specific, agonizing byproduct of a human body unilaterally deciding that it had absorbed its absolute maximum threshold for abuse and violently venting the psychological pressure before the heart exploded. A biological release triggered not by conscious choice, but by the crushing weight of an injustice too massive to keep buried. A single, heavy tear tracked down his deeply scarred face with the agonizing slowness of a casualty that isn't rushing, because the catastrophic pain it represents isn't going to vanish anytime soon. He climbed down the ladder, rung by agonizing rung, and when his boots hit the bottom of the deep trench, and he dropped to his knees to press his calloused palms flat into the damp clay, executing the exact same diagnostic ritual he had performed 10,000 times. The pulse was waiting for him, violently stronger than the day before. It is genuinely sickening to wrap your head around the fact that a human being could be that utterly vile, isn't it? That standing face to face with 4 decades of God-tier experience, confronted by a veteran who approached her with his hat in his hands, and a dead calm voice not begging for a promotion, but desperately trying to stop a mass casualty event. Her absolute only response was to aggressively point a finger and scream, "Illiterate," in front of a firing squad of cowards. If you feel that same violent, suffocating outrage burning in your chest right now, smash that like button to prove you are 100% standing shoulder to shoulder with old Bartholomew. High above, the massive rotary drill had been aggressively repositioned for the dawn shift. The programmed digital vector drove it straight through the heart of the southern quadrant. Bartholomew stayed locked on his knees at the bottom of the deep trench, his bare hands pressing hard into the dirt, his face still damp, physically absorbing the violent, terrifying pulse hammering into his palms. It was radiating a horrific, aggressive new intensity that he had learned to translate as an apocalyptic countdown, the earth violently screaming that the window for negotiation was rapidly slamming shut. Tomorrow morning, the multi-ton drill was going to violently rip through that exact coordinate, and he was trapped at the bottom of a mud pit, armed with a psychotic threat of instant termination if he ever dared to open his mouth and warn them again. He pushed himself up to his feet. He stared straight up at the narrow, blinding slice of blue sky at the top of the excavation, his face locked in the terrifying, dead calm expression of a man who has rapidly calculated his remaining tactical options, and realized with absolute cold clarity that none of those options were massive enough to stop the nuclear bomb ticking under the boots of every single arrogant suit walking on the surface. Then he looked down at his own calloused hands, and he started building the kill plan. The morning broke with that specific hyper-crisp cinematic lighting that usually precedes a day that is going to permanently alter history, long before a single soul realizes the timeline is about to snap. The massive rotary drill had been stealthily repositioned under the cover of darkness, maneuvered and laser-calibrated with the exact kind of obsessive, paranoid reverence that the corporate executives absolutely refused to extend to the human beings bleeding in the dirt. The massive carbide drill bit was locked dead onto the southern quadrant, perfectly aligned with the flawless digital vector. The tech squad had swarmed the rig 3 hours before dawn to guarantee every single sensor was green before Veronica arrived to aggressively supervise what had been hyped in the corporate memos as the absolute crown jewel phase of the excavation. Bartholomew had breached the perimeter before anyone else. He did it in total ghost-like silence, completely bypassing the chaotic morning muster, descending straight into the deep footings with the robotic, invisible compliance of a grunt who had been banished to the dungeon and accepted his fate. But his eyes, from the exact millisecond his boots hit the bottom of the trench that morning, were deadlocked on the towering silhouette of the rotary drill. The beast spooled up, initiating the excavation with that deafening, bone-rattling, deep-bass roar of a multi-million-dollar engine operating flawlessly within its factory parameters. It was the exact acoustic signature that is simultaneously terrifying and deeply pacifying to the arrogant suits who blindly believe that a machine sounding healthy is absolute proof that the universe is under control. Veronica was holding court with her iPad, stationed a safe, sterile distance from the blast zone, radiating the aggressive, hyper-vigilant posture of a tyrant who demands her supervision be acknowledged by everyone in the zip code. The 2 junior yes-men flanked her, clutching their own glowing tablets, locked into the pathetic, sycophantic wedge formation that had become the toxic signature of this specific war zone. The high-res telemetry graphs on her iPad were actively rendering the seismic feedback in real time. The glowing digital lines spiked and dipped with the flawless, predictable rhythm of solid Earth, being aggressively penetrated by a high-velocity carbide bit, returning data that the million-dollar algorithms had been specifically programmed to rubber stamp as perfectly safe. Everything was in the green. Veronica smirked, barking something at the junior engineer on her right, and both cowards instantly flashed the sycophantic, relieved grins of men watching their boss's arrogant theory be proven correct on a 4K screen. "You see that?" Her voice violently sliced down into the deep trench, shredded by the acoustic distortion of the massive pit, but the radioactive arrogance carried the words with perfect clarity. "Elite German tech absolutely never fails." The massive drill bit plunged deeper, and that was the exact millisecond the Earth fundamentally mutated. It wasn't a catastrophic shift that a single million-dollar sensor registered. The glowing graphs on the iPads continued to blindly hum along in the green zone, radiating the terrifying, psychotic indifference of digital instruments that are only programmed to measure what they are told to measure, remaining totally blind to the apocalypse lurking 1 inch outside their algorithm. The digital gas pressure monitors remained permanently locked at 0, displaying the arrogant stability of a system that hasn't received the kill signal yet. But the catastrophic mutation was there. Bartholomew froze dead in the trench. Not the slow, confused hesitation of a guy deciding to take a break. It was the violent, absolute paralysis of a master operator who has just been hit with a radioactive warning siren that demands every single ounce of his biological processor immediately shut down and focus. He dropped his bare hand straight into the dirt. The subterranean frequency had fundamentally shifted. Not the raw kinetic intensity, not the physical location, the frequency. That microscopic, terrifying acoustic mutation that is the razor-thin difference between a heart beating at a normal resting rate and a heart violently accelerating into tachycardia moments before a massive coronary event. That horrific physiological anticipation that the instruments only catch seconds after the body has already realized it's dying. He stared down at his heavy boots. He violently ripped them off. He planted his bare, scarred feet directly into the damp clay of the trench floor. It was a highly deliberate, aggressive tactical maneuver, the exact physical equivalent of cranking a radio receiver to absolute maximum sensitivity at the exact millisecond you desperately need to catch a dying transmission. He needed that pure, unfiltered analog contact that even his balding, paper-thin leather soles were partially intercepting. And the Earth screamed at him. It was a violent, rhythmic, deafening throb, a relentless pounding heartbeat. It absolutely wasn't a poetic metaphor. It was the literal physical manifestation of millions of cubic feet of hyper-pressurized methane, violently hammering against the thinning clay crust from the inside out. The relentless, aggressive rhythm of a massive bomb that has built up an apocalyptic level of kinetic impatience, desperately hunting for the microscopic path of least resistance. The blowout pocket was actively fracturing. It hadn't completely detonated yet, but the massive carbide drill bit was aggressively screaming down toward the exact coordinate where the clay armor was paper-thin, the exact kill zone he had forensically identified days ago, where the soil discoloration had screamed its warning to the only guy who knew how to read it. He whipped his head toward the manual escape valve. 50 yards. The massive, rusted iron wheel had been sitting there since before the corporate developers even bought the grid, installed decades ago by some forgotten old-school engineer who understood that this cursed terrain absolutely required a manual pressure bleed. It was a heavy analog safety net that had been arrogantly ignored by the new regime, blending into the background with the tragic invisibility of critical infrastructure that nobody cares about until it's the absolute only thing keeping you out of a body bag. 50 yards of chaotic, obstacle-heavy open ground between him and the valve. He ran the kill math in his head. The drill was plunging. The subterranean heartbeat was violently accelerating. There was a microscopic, terrifying window between the exact millisecond the blowout pocket fractured enough for the gas to find an exit, and the exact millisecond that exit route mutated into the barrel of a massive bomb. That razor-thin window wasn't predictable with a calculator, but there was a primal, analog warning signal he had learned to hunt for over 3 decades of surviving gas pocket war zones. A signal that always arrived right before catastrophic failure, with a terrifying consistency that had saved his life more than once because he learned it in the mud. not from a PDF. It was a smell, heavy, metallic, the highly specific nauseating scent of hyperpressurized methane, violently forcing its way through microscopic fractures in the clay armor, milliseconds before the main crust shatters. A scent that hit the air before the sound, before the earth visibly moved, before any million-dollar sensor triggered an alarm. He violently inhaled through his nose. It was there, faint, barely registering over the diesel exhaust. But it was absolutely there, hitting the precise threshold that screamed the detonation wasn't instantaneous. But the countdown was far too short to run the standard corporate protocol. There was absolutely zero time to scramble up the ladder, scream at the suits, beg for authorization, and wait for the cowardly chain of command to officially order a shutdown. He launched himself up the wooden trench ladder. He didn't use the rungs. He aggressively vaulted up the outer rails, executing that terrifying monkey-like scramble that only veterans who have spent decades surviving collapsing pits master. A hyper-efficient, highly illegal maneuver that bypasses every safety manual on Earth but gets you to the surface 3 seconds faster. He breached the lip of the trench and started violently waving his arms. The massive rotary drill was parked dead between him and Veronica, projecting a deafening physical wall of engine noise that completely saturated the airspace. It wasn't just loud, it was an aggressive, suffocating acoustic barrage that violently shoved all other sound to the margins. He screamed at the top of his lungs, "Kill the engine! Kill it right damn now!" His voice was a heavy, gravelly rasp, shredded by the panic that aggressively spiked the pitch, but failed to generate the massive volume required to punch through the roar of a state-of-the-art German diesel block. His vocal cords, scarred by 62 years of breathing dust and screaming over heavy iron, had hard limits. The desperate, fragmented words barely survived the crossfire. Veronica slowly turned her head in his direction. For one agonizing microsecond, their eyes locked across the 30-yard no-man's land. A gap short enough to easily read body language, but far too massive for the absolute, apocalyptic terror burning in Bartholomew's eyes to register with the high-def clarity she desperately needed to see. She violently rolled her eyes. She turned her back to him in pure disgust. And she barked a sharp command at the drill operator, deploying that aggressive, dismissive hand gesture of an executive swatting away a pathetic distraction so she can get back to printing money. The operator caught the signal, interpreted it exactly how he was trained to interpret her toxic commands, as an absolute non-negotiable order to push harder. The drill's RPM aggressively spiked. Bartholomew stood paralyzed for one terrifying microsecond. It was the exact hyper-compressed millisecond, where an apex operator violently cycles through every single tactical option, running a lightning-fast triage that completely bypasses panic. It's the absolute, zero-Kelvin clarity of a master who has instantly deleted every useless variable and isolated the only path that ends with him breathing tomorrow. There was exactly one option left on the board: the rusted valve. And that is exactly when the first crack detonated. It was a sharp, bone-dry snap, a singular, horrific acoustic event that absolutely was not an explosion. It was the terrifying, agonizing sound that precedes the explosion, the catastrophic sound of a hyper-pressurized containment vessel violently ripping open its first massive fracture. The exact millisecond the trapped monster finds the exit wound it's been hunting for and begins aggressively tearing its way out. The massive rotary drill violently shuddered, not the standard rhythmic vibration of heavy machinery doing its job. It was a chaotic, sickening lurch that originated from underneath the tracks. It was the earth violently kicking back from the abyss, screaming from the exact zone where the million-dollar sensors were happily registering absolute zero. The digital gas pressure monitors on the iPads were still happily reading flatline zero. But Bartholomew physically felt the earth violently heave under his bare feet, transmitting that undeniable, horrific clarity of solid ground, catastrophically mutating into a liquid state. The crust had transitioned from a contained armor plate into a violently shifting fault line, crossing the point of no return, without a single digital alarm sounding the bell. The blowout pocket had breached. It hadn't fully blown the lid off yet. It had cracked just enough for the hyper-pressurized payload to find the primary fracture and start screaming toward the surface at a terrifying, accelerating velocity dictated entirely by millions of pounds of stored kinetic energy. It wasn't the speed of an explosion yet. It was the terrifying speed of anticipation, the razor-thin execution window rapidly slamming shut between the initial breach and total annihilation. Bartholomew was already in a dead sprint. 50 yards. His bare, calloused feet slammed into the jagged dirt of the job site with the desperate, intimate familiarity he had forged over a lifetime. He was aggressively hauling toward the rusted valve with the absolute certainty of a commando charging a bunker he had memorized on day one, his sniper eyes having automatically mapped the escape routes long before the sirens started screaming. The deafening roar of the rotary drill hadn't stopped, and the earth directly surrounding the massive carbide bit was beginning to splinter with that agonizing, deceptive slowness that always precedes a violent shockwave. The slow, terrifying widening of the primary fracture that looks almost peaceful, right up until the exact millisecond it violently obliterates everything in a 50-yard radius. The sound of bare feet slapping the hard-packed dirt was completely different from the heavy thud of steel-toe boots. Bartholomew wasn't listening to his own footsteps. He was actively reading the ground with every single frantic stride. His bare soles were aggressively intercepting a massive stream of telemetry data that thick rubber would have completely insulated him from. He felt the terrifying shift in the Earth's density with every yard he closed on the valve. He felt the initial low-frequency pulse violently mutating into a high-frequency tremor. He felt the tremor escalating into a massive kinetic heave. He knew exactly what direction the shockwave was hunting. He knew the payload was racing toward the surface, and he knew the surface was just yards away from a massive drill bit that was spinning at maximum RPM because an arrogant suit had ordered it to speed up. 50 yards, 40 yards. In the extreme periphery of his vision, he caught the two private security goons. They had violently reacted to Veronica's initial scream with the mindless, aggressive reflex of attack dogs, trained to instantly tackle anyone their boss points at, completely failing to process the apocalyptic threat level of the environment before blindly executing the order. Tackle that psycho. He's trying to sabotage the drill. The two heavily armored guards aggressively converged on his vector, automatically executing the basic tactical geometry that two men instinctively run when they are trying to violently intercept a single moving target. Bartholomew hadn't executed a high-speed evasive sprint with this level of absolute life-or-death urgency in decades. But there is a terrifying, lethal muscle memory forged by 40 years of surviving chaotic, collapsing war zones that has absolutely nothing to do with youthful speed. It's the god-tier precision of a veteran, the preternatural ability to exert the absolute minimum amount of physical effort at the exact right millisecond, the uncanny, ghost-like capacity to calculate the incoming trajectory of a threat and effortlessly slip through the microscopic gap between two moving bodies that neither attacker even realizes is open yet. He violently juked right through the gap. It wasn't a sleek cinematic dodge. It was a brutal, ugly, functional survival maneuver. The chaotic, desperate geometry of a man doing whatever it takes to stay alive, sacrificing aesthetics for raw efficiency. 30 yards, 20 yards. The massive rusted iron wheel was waiting exactly where it had been bolted into the dirt on day one. It had sat there completely ignored while the mud pit around it had violently mutated into a massive excavation zone, while million-dollar rigs were parked, while the arrogant corporate blueprints were drafted. Ignored with the terrifying, stupid consistency that humans apply to life-saving infrastructure. Completely invisible garbage right up until the exact millisecond. It is the absolute only thing standing between you and a body bag. Bartholomew hit the iron. His calloused, scarred hands violently clamped onto the wheel, with the desperate, tactile recognition of an operator who had mentally flagged this exact valve on his first patrol, running the paranoid threat assessment of a veteran who always maps the exits before the fire starts. The rusted iron violently shrieked under his palms, fighting back with the massive, unyielding resistance of a mechanical gear that had been locked shut and left to rot for years, heavily oxidized and fighting to stay dead. He violently cranked the wheel, both hands, counterclockwise. He ripped into it with that highly specific, terrifying old man strength that you cannot build in an expensive, air-conditioned gym. You can't fake it for a mirror. It is the raw, brutal, dense power forged by a human body, spending decades executing labor, that demands actual agonizing resistance. Power that aggressively stacks deep into the shoulders, the lower back, and the forearms in a way that doesn't look impressive under a tailored shirt, but violently explodes when rusted iron refuses to budge. The iron shrieked in agony, and the valve cracked open. The supersonic hiss that violently erupted from the subterranean pipe was absolutely deafening. It carried the terrifying, aggressive acoustic signature of a massive, hyper-pressurized payload violently escaping its cage. It wasn't an explosion, but it possessed the overwhelming, concussive volume of a monster that had been trapped in the dark for way too long. A massive, violent jet of hyper-compressed methane and toxic mud violently shotgunned out of the valve and blasted straight up into the sky, screaming with the pure, kinetic fury of a bomb that had finally found the path of least resistance and took it. A massive, towering white plume aggressively bloomed above the valve. It possessed that terrifying, involuntary beauty that only highly lethal events generate. A mesmerizing, violent release of pure energy that absolutely shouldn't look majestic, but completely dominates the skyline. And then, the dead silence hit. Not an instantaneous, absolute vacuum. The massive engine of the rotary drill roared for a few more agonizing seconds, before the terrified operator, finally processing the apocalyptic event detonating 30 yards away, violently slammed the emergency kill switch. He executed the shutdown with the frantic, terrified muscle memory that safety drills burn into your brain so you can find the button without having to think. The silence that violently choked out the job site after the massive diesel block died was the heavy, suffocating quiet that only drops when 100 people are trapped in the exact same spot. Absolutely nobody fully understands what just happened, but every single soul feels the massive, terrifying gravity of an event that permanently splits their timeline into before and after. Veronica bolted, not toward Bartholomew. She sprinted directly toward the heavy telemetry monitoring station, driven by the frantic, terrified urgency of an executive who desperately requires external, digital confirmation to process the nightmare her naked eyes just witnessed. She needed the glowing numbers on the screen to validate the catastrophe, because her brain was violently refusing to accept reality without a technological middleman. The primary monitor was screaming. The 4K screen was violently flashing blood red, broadcasting massive block letters that absolutely eradicated any room for alternate corporate spin. Critical gas detected. Catastrophic pressure. Spike. The exact horrifying data points the million-dollar sensors had finally managed to flag, only after the blowout pocket had violently fractured enough for the methane's chemical signature to saturate the mud. Only after Bartholomew had violently ripped the rusted valve open. Only after the apocalyptic pressure had successfully bypassed the spinning drill bit and found a safe exit. She stood paralyzed in front of the screaming monitor, her iPad dangling uselessly from her hand. She had completely stopped looking at it 2 minutes ago. She was just clutching the dead glass now, her face radiating a horrific, bloodless pallor that didn't come from the terror of what had just happened, but the soul-crushing, psychotic horror of what had almost happened. It is the highly specific, terrifying distinction that separates a bad scare from a total psychological collapse. If Bartholomew hadn't ripped that rusted valve open, the massive high-velocity carbide bit, violently slamming into hyper-pressurized methane at the exact millisecond the clay armor shattered, produces extreme kinetic friction. That violent friction, grinding in a saturated methane environment, generates an instant, catastrophic spark. That microscopic spark, detonating inside a massive blowout pocket at that extreme depth, in a congested trench packed with 50 men, would have triggered a thermonuclear explosion. The blast radius had already been calculated by corporate risk assessors, who were too terrified to ever say the actual body count out loud in a boardroom. 50 yards. Absolute, total vaporization in every direction. A heavy black luxury SUV had slammed its brakes on the outer perimeter of the grid, right before the silence fell, positioning it as a terrifying, unintentional witness. It possessed that specific, heavy perspective of an entity that crashes a scene it didn't plan on attending, but the universe aggressively chose for it. The titan who owned the multi-billion-dollar development firm stepped out of the back seat. He was an older silverback with a shock of snow-white hair, radiating the heavy, unmistakable posture of an apex predator who had spent his entire life bleeding in the trenches, and therefore scanned a war zone completely differently than a suit who spent his life in a corner office. He visually audited the dirt before he looked at the men. He aggressively assessed the structural integrity of the grid before he gave a damn about the quarterly reports. He stared hard at the massive toxic plume still aggressively venting into the sky above the rusted valve. He locked his eyes on the screaming, blood-red monitor. He stared dead at Veronica, and then his eyes violently locked onto the old man standing next to the iron wheel. Hands still gripping the rusted metal, bare feet caked in mud, a hissing hearing aid jammed in his ear, projecting the terrifying, absolute dead calm peace of a warrior who had just executed the mission, survived the crossfire, and was now standing firmly on the other side of the apocalypse, existing in that quiet, untouchable sanctuary that only opens up after the adrenaline crashes and your brain realizes you aren't in a body bag today. What the hell just happened here? He barked the question at the entire grid, but the massive gravitational weight of the interrogation was pointed directly at Veronica, like a laser designator. It carried the cold, brutal objectivity of an executioner demanding the official timeline before he starts drafting the warrants. Veronica started stammering. Her panicked voice scrambled to construct a highly sanitized, defensive narrative in real time. She was desperately trying to force the apocalyptic event into a corporate framework that would somehow protect the toxic illusion she had spent months building. The arrogant fairy tale of flawless German technology, of infallible digital sensors that eliminate human error, of the elite Ivy League engineer, who had treated actual blue-collar experience like an annoying disease. The billionaire listened to the garbage spin for exactly 5 seconds. Then he raised one hand, silencing her completely. And he marched straight toward Bartholomew. There was something in the Titan's heavy stride as he closed the distance that was fundamentally different from how he stepped out of the SUV. It carried a heavy, accelerating momentum of dawning recognition that bypassed conscious thought. The specific, aggressive acceleration of a man who realizes he is looking at a ghost he absolutely never expected to find in this particular graveyard. He stopped 3 feet from the old man. He stared hard at the deeply scarred, weather-beaten face. He stared at the crushed straw hat that had magically found its way back onto Bartholomew's head after the sprint. He stared at the heavily calloused hands still resting on the rusted iron wheel, projecting that terrifying, effortless comfort of a master who didn't retreat because the kill zone was still exactly where he needed to be. "Are you Bartholomew from the Deep South?" The question didn't carry the suspicious, interrogating tone of the other arrogant suits on this grid. It wasn't a boss trying to catch a grunt in a lie. It was the heavy, awestruck tone of a man verifying a legend, a man confirming a myth he needed to lock down before he started rewriting his own history books. The absolute legend who dismantled the massive water tower at the old municipal stadium without a single structural blueprint. There was a dark, heavy ghost story that had aggressively circulated for decades among the hardened, old-school structural engineers of a certain era. The guys who had bled in the trenches back when the industry violently mashed 2 languages together, the shiny college diploma and the raw, dirty magic of the trade. Back when there was still breathing room for the 2 worlds to violently debate, before arrogant tech startups convinced everyone that an iPad made the grunt obsolete. The municipal water tower had been a terrifying 100-foot-tall concrete monster that desperately needed to be surgically dismantled. The original architectural blueprints had burned to ash in a catastrophic archive fire decades prior. Absolutely no one knew exactly how the beast was structurally anchored, which meant absolutely no one knew how to drop it without accidentally leveling the neighboring city block. It had been Bartholomew, armed with nothing but his bare hands, relying entirely on 40 years of aggressively reading stress loads, packed dirt, rusted rebar, and the violent physics that govern how heavy iron begs to fall. 0 CAD blueprints, 0 multi-million-dollar computer simulations, relying purely on that terrifying god-tier internal radar, forged over a lifetime in the mud. A superpower that lacked a fancy corporate acronym, but the billionaire, who had been a terrified greenhorn junior engineer standing in the dirt that day, watching the master work with his jaw on the floor, had permanently burned into his memory as raw, undeniable, practical genius. Bartholomew slowly lifted his hands off the rusted iron wheel. He stood tall, barefoot in the blood-red clay, dirt caked between his toes, radiating that profound, serene confidence of a man who isn't shocked by the recognition, because he never needed a billionaire to tell him he was a titan. He gave a slow, single nod. Yes. The billionaire stared at him for a long, heavy minute, his face locked in the intense expression of a CEO aggressively rewriting the entire narrative he had been fed about this job site. He realized with sickening clarity that the sanitized emails and glossy progress reports his executives had been spoon-feeding him were an absolute catastrophic lie. Veronica was hovering in the background. Her iPad was still clutched in her hand, but the glowing 4K telemetry graphs she had arrogantly worshipped all morning had violently mutated into a death warrant. Those exact same digital lines that had smugly reported all clear while a barefoot 62-year-old man used his souls to detect the apocalypse the machines were totally blind to. Bartholomew slowly turned his head and locked eyes with her. There was absolutely zero smug victory in his stare. No pathetic, vindictive smirk waiting for an apology. It was the terrifying, dead calm gaze of a survivor standing on the other side of a blast wave, reporting the casualty numbers with the absolute, icy detachment that surviving a massacre provides. You blindly trusted your shiny sensors. His voice carried that signature heavy rasp, zero-volume spike completely devoid of the hot rage he could have easily deployed, choosing instead to execute her with pure, cold fact. I trusted the dirt. A lethal, suffocating pause. My old man beat this into my skull decades ago. The earth is always screaming, but you only catch the transmission if you know how to listen with your boots. The silence that nuked the grid after that sentence wasn't just Veronica's agonizing, suffocating embarrassment, although she was absolutely drowning in it. It was the terrifying, collective silence of 100 grunts and suits scattered across the blast radius, each one violently processing the razor-thin margin between the massacre that almost happened and the fact that they were still breathing. That microscopic, terrifying gap was exactly 50 yards, a rusted iron wheel, and the bare feet of an old man standing in the mud. The billionaire stepped forward and clamped a heavy hand onto Bartholomew's shoulder. It was a brutally simple gesture, the exact kind of physical communication that doesn't require a single syllable, because the heavy corporate apology and the massive check would come later, when the smoke cleared. In that specific millisecond, it was more than enough. It transmitted everything that needed to be said using the direct, undeniable language that men who have bled in the trenches use, saying infinitely more with a heavy grip than a suit could say in a 2-hour PowerPoint presentation. Bartholomew casually leveled his crushed straw hat on his head, and he finally peeled his feet off the packed dirt, walking over to slip his battered leather boots back on, the exact boots he had abandoned at the bottom of the deep trench that morning, when he violently needed to boost his radar to absolute maximum sensitivity, to catch the transmission the Earth was desperately trying to send. The Earth had screamed, and the transmission had been received. The billionaire stood paralyzed in the dirt for a long, heavy minute after the massive white gas plume finally bled out and vanished into the sky. The grid was locked in that highly specific, terrifying silence that always suffocates a war zone immediately after a near-miss catastrophe. That heavy, ringing quiet that drops when 100 people are standing exactly where a nuclear bomb almost detonated, aggressively processing the almost with the exact same violent physiological shock as if the bomb had actually gone off. Because the human nervous system doesn't elegantly separate a near-death experience from actual trauma until the rational brain has hours to catch up. The billionaire slowly pivoted to face Veronica. He didn't rush. He executed the turn with that terrifying, deliberate slowness of an apex predator who has already finalized the execution order and fully understands that dragging out the approach is a critical part of the psychological torture. Knowing that there are specific massacres where the excruciating delay communicates the absolute, fatal gravity of the impending strike infinitely better than a screaming sprint, he stopped dead exactly 3 feet from her face, utilizing the entire silent job site as his audience. The grunts, the terrified junior techs, the site foreman, and the 2 private security goons who had violently attempted to tackle Bartholomew were all paralyzed in the dirt, trapped as mandatory witnesses to a public execution that absolutely nobody had scheduled on the morning Gantt chart. You catastrophically failed the engineering. His voice dropped into a low, terrifying rumble that didn't need a megaphone to shatter her spine. The $1 million sensors you aggressively worshipped completely failed to flag the blowout pocket. The elite rotary drill you swore was infallible violently failed. A lethal, agonizing pause. But technical failures can be mitigated and repaired. Veronica was clutching the iPad against her chest with a white-knuckle death grip. Her posture was rigidly locked in that pathetic, involuntary reflex of a terrified human using a prop as a physical barricade, desperately giving her shaking hands a task when her brain has completely short-circuited. You catastrophically failed basic humanity. The next volley of words was fired with an agonizing, deliberate separation, ensuring every single syllable detonated before the next one launched. That man approached you holding 40 years of God-tier survival experience. He approached you with absolute respect, holding his hat in his hands, begging for the bare minimum of your attention to save our lives, and you aggressively weaponized his physical hearing disability to publicly humiliate him in front of my entire crew. The massive job site was completely, terrifyingly silent. That man is worth infinitely more than every single Ivy League diploma you have ever printed. It wasn't hyperbole. It was a cold, hard financial and moral audit. Because your arrogant diplomas completely evaporated the millisecond the machines flatlined. What he brings to this grid doesn't require a battery. He carried it in his bones when he walked through the gate, and he's carrying it right now. Veronica opened her mouth to speak. Absolutely nothing came out. Not because she surrendered easily. Her brain was frantically spinning up a massive, complex architecture of pathetic excuses, mitigating circumstances, and corporate jargon, running the defensive algorithms she had spent her entire academic career mastering. But there was a crushing, undeniable reality, actively suffocating her in that exact moment, that rendered every single defense totally irrelevant before it even hit her tongue. The radioactive hiss of the vented methane still ringing in their ears. The ghost of the massive white plume that had towered over the rusted valve she had arrogantly ignored. The terrifying memory of the digital monitor flashing 0, while a barefoot 62-year-old grunt read the apocalyptic truth directly from the mud that her German tech was completely blind to. She snapped her mouth shut. She clutched the iPad with both arms, wrapping it in a pathetic, desperate hug. The absolute last piece of armor she had left in the world. And she walked off the grid, not with a single word. Not with the aggressive, arrogant, rapid-fire stomp she had weaponized when she first breached the site on day one, flanked by her sycophants and her shiny toys, radiating the toxic certainty of a tyrant who had never been punched in the mouth by reality. She walked with the heavy, broken shuffle of a fraud who is retreating because every single other exit has been violently welded shut, walled in by a hissing gas pipe, a 2mm margin of error, and an old man sprinting barefoot 50 yards across red dirt. The two junior engineers who had cowardly shadowed her every move all week stood completely paralyzed in the dirt as she vanished through the main gate. Their faces were locked in the terrified, blank expression of pawns, desperately trying to recalculate their survival strategy on a chessboard that just had its entire geometry violently rewritten. The billionaire slowly pivoted to face Bartholomew. The dynamic between the two silverbacks as they squared off was fundamentally different from any other interaction that Grid had witnessed in weeks. It carried the heavy, unspoken recognition of their brief, legendary encounter decades ago. That highly specific, bulletproof continuity of a blood oath respect that gets paused for 20 years, but instantly resumes exactly where it left off, because the foundation it was built on is completely immune to the erosion of time. The Titan dropped the offer with the ruthless, cut-the-crap objectivity of an apex predator, who knows exactly what asset he needs, and sees absolutely zero tactical value in bearing the pitch in fake corporate foreplay. Senior Geotechnical Sensory Consultant, a completely fabricated title that had absolutely never existed on any corporate flowchart in the history of the firm. It was violently willed into existence in that exact millisecond, to formally capture the raw, unexplainable magic that Bartholomew had just weaponized to save their lives. A god-tier skill set that totally defied standard engineering terminology, but the billionaire was desperate to honor with the heaviest corporate crown he could forge. An elite, executive-tier salary. Bartholomew absorbed the massive offer, with that terrifying deep ocean calm of a master who isn't frantically calculating the zeros while the pitch is happening. He listened to the entire transmission before allowing his brain to formulate a response. When the billionaire finally stopped talking, the dead air hung between them for a few heavy seconds. "I accept the post." His words dropped with that signature, unshakable simplicity, completely devoid of the dramatic, emotional flexing the moment could have easily justified. "But I have one non-negotiable condition." The billionaire held his ground, waiting. Every single grunt bleeding on this grid possesses a lethal intelligence that doesn't exist in any textbook. Bartholomew slowly swept his eyes across the exhausted, mud-caked laborers surrounding them. The exact same men who had silently watched his public humiliation, who had silently watched him rip the rusted valve open, and who were now standing frozen in the dirt, fully aware they were witnessing a moment that would become a permanent legend in the trenches. A raw genius forged entirely from brutal labor, relentless repetition, and decades of getting baked in the sun, making mistakes, and surviving them. A heavy, lethal pause. "You are going to finance and mandate a hardcore training academy right here in the dirt. A place where these men can teach what they know. Not a place where they are lectured to. A place where they are the professors." The billionaire gave a single hard nod. "And there's one more thing." Bartholomew slowly raised his scarred hand to the rusted hearing aid, executing the automatic paranoid tap he had performed 10,000 times. Decades of surviving deafening demo sites without proper safety gear completely shredded my hearing. It wasn't my fault, and it wasn't bad luck. It was the brutal, unregulated meat grinder this industry used to be. His eyes burned a hole straight through the billionaire with the exact same terrifying clarity he had wielded all week. "You are going to finance the absolute best medical treatment on Earth, the elite top-tier hardware, not because I needed perfect hearing to detect the bomb today, but because I have earned the absolute right to clearly hear my grandson call my name." The billionaire stood paralyzed for a heavy, agonizing minute. There was something profoundly devastating in that final demand. It ripped past the corporate negotiations, past the engineering genius, past the legend of the man, and struck straight into a much deeper, raw nerve. The heartbreaking, simple reality of a 62-year-old warrior thinking about his grandson, calculating the massive, agonizing personal losses he had absorbed in silence for decades, realizing that he still had time to reclaim a stolen piece of his humanity. If someone finally acknowledged that his sacrifice was made in the service of an empire that had never bothered to give him the right armor. Done. The billionaire violently thrust his hand forward. Every single demand. Done. Bartholomew gripped it and locked the oath. The months that violently followed were the kind that build permanent, unkillable empires, purely because they were finally anchored to the raw, bleeding truth that had existed long before the first excavator ever fired up. The underground training academy was officially christened Trench-Level Intel, a brutal no-nonsense title pitched by Bartholomew in a pristine corporate boardroom. It was instantly rubber-stamped with zero pushback by the suits because it was the absolute perfect name. The kind of undeniable heavy iron title that makes any sanitized corporate alternative look pathetic. 6 months after he ripped that rusted valve open, Bartholomew was standing dead center in a pack of hardened grunts on a highly specific, restricted patch of the grid. The corporate suits had aggressively prepped the zone specifically for this masterclass. Raw, violently compacted dirt, totally stripped of concrete, asphalt, or any of the artificial modern barriers that developers constantly pave over the earth to sever the connection between the boots and the planet. His hearing aid was a radically different machine. It was microscopic, hyper-stealth, radiating that sleek, elite quality of medical tech engineered to flawlessly serve the operator, rather than broadcasting a disability to the world. It had been aggressively calibrated by a top-tier audiologist who had spent 2 grueling hours mapping the exact destroyed frequencies in Bartholomew's ears, armed with a blank check budget that completely removed money as an obstacle to perfection. He had heard his grandson scream his name with a staggering crystalline clarity that he had violently lost at age 45. He had sat paralyzed in the audiologist's leather chair for a full minute after the tech flipped the switch, his eyes squeezed shut, wearing an expression that English doesn't have a word heavy enough to describe. The agonizing, beautiful shock of reclaiming a piece of your soul that you had brutally conditioned yourself to survive without, but never, ever, stopped grieving for. The grunts surrounding him were completely barefoot. It was a mandatory, non-negotiable directive Bartholomew had issued before the class even started. 0 corporate PowerPoint explanations were provided, because he knew the true revelation would only detonate through raw, physical experience. The philosophy had to travel straight from the mud, through their calloused souls and into their brains. He stood tall in the center of the pack, occupying the heavy, natural throne he had spent a lifetime earning, not pacing at the front like an arrogant professor lecturing down to his students, but anchored dead center in the mud, acting as the absolute gravitational core that the entire masterclass rotated around. "Kill your eyes. Shut them tight." The grunts obeyed, fighting that brief, awkward hesitation of grown men executing a bizarre command that their bodies hadn't fully processed the tactical value of yet. Now, lock onto the rhythm. Dead silence. Not the empty, hollow quiet of a vacant room. It was the terrifying, dense silence of 20 hardened operators simultaneously weaponizing their focus on the exact same frequency. The massive physical gravity that a collective hyper-vigilant attention span generates when it aims all its firepower at a single target. If the dirt throbs with a heavy, rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat, you're sitting on a massive water table. Bartholomew's voice commanded the airspace with a terrifying new clarity that the elite hardware had restored to him, a heavy, resonant boom that had always been buried inside him, violently resurrected after a long, dark exile. If it violently chatters like a snare drum, you're standing on solid bedrock, a heavy, lethal pause. But if it throbs with a sickening, hollow hiss, he didn't even need to finish the sentence. Every single grunt standing barefoot in that dirt knew exactly how that nightmare sentence ended. They had all been breathing the dust on the grid that catastrophic morning. They had heard the deafening, supersonic hiss. They had watched the apocalyptic white plume block out the sun. They had stood paralyzed in the exact blast radius where a nuclear bomb had almost vaporized them. And the only reason they were still breathing was because one old man had learned how to read the language of the dirt with his bare feet, during an era when that was the absolute only technology that existed. There ain't $1 million sensor on this planet that can teach you that. Deep in the background, standing at the edge of the restricted zone, the billionaire titan stood with his arms aggressively crossed over his chest. He was wearing the intense, deeply satisfied expression of a warlord watching a high-risk tactical gamble he had authorized pay out massive, undeniable dividends, watching the raw, chaotic power of the trenches finally being harnessed in a way he had always hoped. But seeing it execute in reality is a completely different thrill than reading it in a proposal. Mounted at the primary choke point of the main gate, a massive, heavy iron plaque had been violently bolted into the concrete. It radiated that brutal simplicity of a monument, where the absolute truth of the words was selected long before they bothered picking the font or the metal. Because when the message is flawless, the aesthetics are irrelevant. The wisdom of the dirt is the foundation of the empire. Now I'm throwing the mic to you. Do you genuinely believe that the raw, bloody, empirical survival skills forged in the trenches absolutely obliterate shiny $1 million technology the exact second the machines hit a catastrophic blind spot? Have you ever survived a nightmare on a job site, in a trauma ward, or in a sweltering kitchen, where your gut instinct and calloused hands caught the kill shot seconds before the expensive digital Lee sensors even woke up? Drop your war stories in the comments. I want to read the bloodbath. This legendary story aggressively proves that the lethal knowledge absorbed through your boots, your scarred hands, and decades of brutal, honest labor is absolutely never inferior to the sanitized theories printed on an Ivy League diploma. Both weapons are desperately required to win the war, and aggressively humiliating the blue-collar titans who bleed in the mud before your technology even exists is the absolute most catastrophic, fatal mistake an empire can make. Because the blast radius always takes out the tyrant too. The ironclad humility to shut your mouth and learn from the master, regardless of what tax bracket he belongs to, is the absolute only software that never crashes. If you love stories that hit you right in the chest, violently celebrate the unstoppable genius of the working class, and prove that real experience is a currency no bank can hold, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss the next execution. Our crew is waiting for you in the trenches. In fun wise.